Thanks for joining our broadcast on exploring implicit bias in the History Social Science classroom. I'm Michelle Herzog. I'm the History Social Science Coordinator 3 for the Los Angeles County Office of Education. We're here right now situated in Module 3, exploring the ethnic transformations of California. And Part 3 of this, which we're about to present, is on California Present, on critical hope. Part 1 sort of set the stage for us, all of us here in California, the changing demographics and what that means. Part 2 was on the term transformative resistance, which you'll find in the Ethnic Studies model curriculum. Right now, we'll talk about critical hope, and we hope you stay tuned for Part 4, where we talk about California's future and its radical healing. So I'm thrilled again to re-invite my good friend and colleague, Barbara Vallejo-Doughton, Project Director for the California Global Education Project at Cal State Long Beach, and just a fabulous teacher leader. Lots of great teaching experience in Long Beach Unified and LA Unified. So Barb, thanks again. We're excited to hear about Part 3 and critical hope.
Thank you, Michelle. Just to kind of reground ourselves again in the values and principles, transformative resistance, critical hope, and radical healing come from the model curriculum. And the idea that I'd like to bring out for this particular part is the critical hope. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about critical hope, it's about features of a just society and how communities of color have articulated justice. And what does that look like, and how is it operational in our communities today? So when we talk about justice, we have to think about, well, what do we mean by justice? Because justice to one group might mean compliance to another, or injustice to another, right? So one of the things that I encourage teachers to do with themselves as a group, and also with their students, I think it would be a really good activity, is to explore this idea of justice. What is it? So if we create a visual representation of justice and have our critical lens and our cultural lens on, how might that look? I want to say that I think, and having 36 years in the classroom, that because of the different cultural lenses that would come up, that there'll be different iterations of what justice looks like. And that's important to unpack. Because when we talk about critical hope, can you have hope without justice? Or can you have justice without hope? Right? So exploring what that looks like, writing either in a journal or on a sheet of paper, what is your description of justice and hope and how those things interact? And how do they show up in your community?
Great questions to think about.
So the next two sections of this particular part are going to be looking at the foundational discipline of Native people and African American. And I wanted to frame it around critical hope because I wanted to bring out what's happening today with those two communities. A lot of things are happening, but I just want to pull one strand. In the Ethnic Studies model curriculum, it explicitly calls out to celebrate and honor Native peoples of the land and communities of Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color by providing a space to share their stories of success, community collaboration, and solidarity, along with their intellectual and cultural wealth. So that's what we'll be exploring today with these two foundational disciplines. So the first one is around the Native peoples. And the question I'd like to raise first is, what has been your experience with narratives that tell the story of Native people? Do you only talk about them or hear about them around Thanksgiving? Or do you only hear about them in November? That's when our President George H.W. Bush declared November as Indigenous or Native Peoples Month. Is that the only time we see Native Americans or even think about them? Because they're still here, right?
Yes. And a very diverse group within, of course.
Exactly. And the point that we've made before, no ethnic group is a monolith.
Yes.
There's so much diversity, and now with intersectionalities of inter-ethnic marriages and relationships, it really mixes that up even more.
Well, and people are doing a lot of these genealogical tests,
Yes.
DNA tests,
Yes.
and just surprised to see so many ethnicities in their family background they didn't know about.
Yes, and being a surprise, but then that's an opportunity, isn't it? To really explore who we are. And I think the more that we can bring in those kinds of stories in the classroom of who we are, the totality of that, I think that's part of the goal of the Ethnic Studies model curriculum.
Yes.
So looking at the Native people, a precursor to the lesson is looking at what's happening in the Dakotas, around the Dakota pipeline. And that is sacred space to the Native people there. Yet, because of economic considerations, political considerations, a pipeline has been built across that sacred space. So as Native people fight to save their sacred spaces, here's some questions around the theme of equity that's in the model curriculum that might kind of center this lesson. What does equity entail? What is the difference between equality and equity, and why does that matter? And then this question, how can one person make a difference in the community, or how does collaborative work make a difference? And what skills and tools are needed to make a change in society? And that's also part of critical hope. So looking at this lesson, and I'll reference the actual lesson in the model curriculum in a minute, it's centered around the theme of social movement and equity and sacred spaces. So in Berkeley today, there is a large retail apartment space that is planned to go up in one part of that city. And it's adjacent to a sacred Ohlone Village shell mound and burial site. So representatives for the retail project claim it would provide 135 new dwelling units and many jobs for the local residents. The Ohlone want to build a shell mound in the area to memorialize the many mounds that were destroyed as the region became more populated. So here we have the classic, right? Do we go with the economic development, or do we go with
honoring sacred space?
Honoring sacred space. So here's the question. How can one individual or the collective make a difference in a community that is grappling with competing goals? That's a question we can ask for any community. But positioning this within the Native American community or the Indigenous people community, it brings out the idea that maybe it's not an either or. And the lesson in the curriculum is titled Development or Preservation. What if we switch that to development and preservation? Is there a way that we can get to both and? And that's what they explore in the lesson around these issues, which I think is a really powerful way to help shift the thinking from binary, where there's a winner and a loser, you're good, you're bad, you're worthy, you're not worthy, to something that, where can we find some space where both can exist?
There's so much energy about identifying historic sites. Historic for who? What groups find those sites historic? You know, you can get that plaque on a building, it's going to preserve the building. But let's look at these sacred spaces too, and how do we preserve them and mark them? I think that's why a lot of people are doing land acknowledgements now.
Right.
Very important piece as well. And they're giving great hope to people and for others as well, for their groups. Right? It's bringing awareness to this. I think that it's a big point. I'm sure there's other stories that highlight this in the model curriculum. Can you talk about a few more of those?
In the model curriculum, there happens to be one that's exactly on this point, develop or preserve the shell mound sacred site struggle. And you raised a really interesting point, you know, sacred for whom? This is an opportunity to bring into the conversation and the narrative the role of spiritual and sacredness for a community, for a culture. And if we look at, I don't know, Notre Dame, what if somebody wanted to build a pipeline, a water pipeline, I know this is outrageous, but something similar, some economic, thing that goes right through, or not through, but around Notre Dame. That's a sacred space to Christians, right? So why is building a retail space on around a Shalman area, why is that poo-pooed, so to speak, right? Who determines that? And do we have room now? And have we learned enough now to acknowledge that different peoples consider different things sacred? And that's not any worse or better, or, on a scale. There's no scale. It's sacred for a reason, right? And how do we honor that?
Good points. Very good point. It brings to mind school mascots, teams, using a lot of Native American caricatures, terminology.
Right. Or
so there's a lot of
taking
discussion.
down the Confederate flag on the South Carolina Capitol, right? There's a lot of tension there. But symbolism. But can we talk through it? Can we have civil discourse around it? Can we empathize, and can we make some kind of an agreement or some kind of a decision around, how are we going to interact in this space without the binary? That's a difficult
It's very difficult.
task.
People are very passionate on multiple sides, right?
Right. But that's the work we need to do. In this idea of sacred space, I'd like to ask this question. what has been your experience with narratives that tell the story of African Americans? So we go from a sacred space being something that was a spiritual place for Native Americans, and then we transition to African Americans, and what I would call sacred space is housing. Where do I live? How do I choose that? What are the opportunities for me to live where I want to live or where I can thrive? And so this next part of this module will be looking at housing and redlining. So here in this visual, we have a picture of housing in a city or a community in the Inland Empire, San Bernardino. Same city, different parts of the city. So what do you notice about the pictures, right? Who do you think lives in these spaces? How do you think they got to live in those spaces? You know, what are the political and economic considerations that had to have taken place for this kind of condition in terms of housing to exist? And just, you know, thinking about that. And what are the systems of power that enable this to happen? So in the model curriculum under systems of power, they raise some really important questions that I'd like to pull out just a couple. What is the relationship between the individual and society? As a woman of color in the 50s and 60s, I couldn't get a loan on my own. I had to have my husband sign for me. I couldn't get a credit card, right? I had to have my husband sign for me. Those systems of power kept many women from being homeowners.
All colors, backgrounds,
Exactly,
race, ethnicity.
exactly.
Yes.
But then layer upon that racial and ethnic discrimination, right? And gender fluidity, which that term wasn't used then, but it existed, right? So what are the implications for society when it categorizes people in a social hierarchy? Do they have access to these sacred spaces, a home? So I chose this piece of data to illustrate what's happening today. This is 2022 data from ABC News and an organization called 538. And they're looking at the area of San Diego. And they're looking at the area in terms of redlining and housing covenants that have occurred. But this is 2022. And if you look at the data on the left side, in the blue and red and sometimes green areas, those areas are identified as hazardous parts of San Diego. Well, who lives there?
What do you mean? What do we mean?
That's the
hazardous?
question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how they determine that, but hazardous.
Environmentally hazardous?
Well, there's the question. Is it environmentally hazardous? Is it economically hazardous?
Yes.
What do they mean by hazardous?
Crime rate.
Right.
Okay.
Crime rates, low income. So if we look at that, we say, it's interesting that they're mostly Latinos and African Americans and other ethnic groups that are in that hazardous zone. Then when we look at the second piece of data, the areas surrounding that, we're looking at La Jolla, Del Mar, Poway, Encinitas, Oceanside. All those are inhabited by white people. Is that just a coincidence? What could be the political, social, economic systems that divide people in communities? And how do we unpack that? I think starting with the data is step one.
I think we could find similar maps in many urban areas.
Many
right?
urban areas, yes.
Even across the country. I saw something in I think it was South Carolina where they had pig farms and a lot of waste and just environmentally unhealthy. And guess who's living there? So it's not an uncommon story.
There's a boom of warehouses for Amazon and other people in places that were the goods and services that we order online and magically appear in our door. And most of those warehouses are located in communities that are maybe lower income, communities that are not served as other communities are. And I've seen images of warehouses and big Amazon trucks. In fact, a friend of mine lives in Rialto. And as I go to her home, Amazon truck, Amazon truck, Amazon truck. Well, she lives 2 blocks away from a warehouse. And she says that's 24/7.
Wow.
So think of the noise, think of the pollution. And if you put that in maybe, I don't know, Encinitas, would that happen? I'm not sure that would happen, right? So these are things we have to
be aware of.
be aware of. So when we're looking at redlining and housing covenants that historically happened and many argue set up this condition that we have today, how might, again, political, social, or economic systems divide people and communities? So in the model curriculum, there's a lesson on U.S. housing inequality and looking at the African American community specifically and how redlining in the 30s, and there's wonderful resources in the model curriculum that trace all of the red line compacts and the language that was used. And they use similar language like the data point in San Diego hazardous, not suitable or low income. And those were the areas where people would steer away from buying homes.
Sure.
And so banks would not create loans there. And in fact, the data...
Property value is lower.
Exactly. The data in the lesson had stated that during the 2008 crash, subprime loans were made, the majority of them were made to communities of color, especially African American communities. So when the crash happened, they lost their homes, right? And so one of the things that comes to light is that building generational wealth and building home ownership go hand in hand. So I am fortunate enough to own my home. I will be able to pass that home down to my children, grandchildren, and whoever else wants it after I'm dead, right? But because I have that generational wealth, that's not true for many communities of color.
Yes.
Right? Sacred space?
Brings a whole new meaning to that.
It does.
So this whole construct of systems of power, something we've seen in societies for many, many years, when we pay attention and realize it, I think many groups are not so aware of it. I know myself was not as aware of it as groups who were more directly affected by that. And I'm sure there, as we know, there's still a lot of examples where it's still existing today. And it still creates barriers. It creates barriers for some groups over others, something we're still struggling with as a nation.
Right. So when we talk about critical hope, what does critical hope look like for those communities? How can we look at this issue through the lens of justice and understand that redlining in the 30s definitely has an impact today, still has an impact. And it wasn't until I think 1968 where that was lifted, where it was discriminatory practices for loans was made into a policy that that was not going to happen anymore. Well, that's relatively recently. And it takes generations to build up this generational wealth and to be a homeowner, especially today where homeownership is so out of reach for so many people who have good jobs, who have careers and that can pay, but not enough, right?
So bringing this back to ethnic studies, implicit bias, the history classroom, when we look through history and highlight this as a theme or a concept, we can see that repeated. And the biases that come into play around this.
Right.
Biases of people affected and biases of others looking inward to that.
Right. So when we look at the Native American experience and the African American experience, what debates and dilemmas remain unresolved in achieving justice for communities of color? What is the relationship between individual power and collective power in resolving these dilemmas? I think in the Native American experience, there is this one person from the Ohlone tribe who is spearheading, getting the community to collaborate, and not just Native Americans, but other people in the community.
Yes,
she went to the
that's
Chambers
helpful
of
too.
Commerces and different organizations to help make the case, right, and to support her. And she's making headway, but again, it's that transformative resistance, right? It's knowing who you are and reshaping your identity to help serve your community, right? It's not abandoning your identity, it's just reshaping it in the political and social landscape that you find yourself in. And then how can you support your students and members of your community to advance the work of justice? I worked at Cabrillo High School, the west side of Long Beach, and it was an underserved community. Many Filipino, Asian Americans, Latinos, and some African American communities, and many of them didn't own their home. Many of them lived in apartments, right? And so to find green spaces or safe spaces for them in their community was really difficult. But they needed to understand that their stories and how they live and where they live, it's not to denigrate them or to feel sorry about them, but it's about thinking, and this is kind of a segue to the next one, how can you operationalize the assets in your community, and you have assets there, even if you're on the west side of Long Beach, there are several assets there that I learned to help build this community of justice that I think everybody is envisioning for their children and their ancestors and people who come after them.
Yeah, and it brings to mind all of this is shaping identity, the importance of knowing your kids. I grew up in apartments too, and there was a mixed community. There was apartments and there were single family homes. And I can tell you, there was a bias.
Was there?
Yeah, on who those people were who got to live in their homes, and those of us who lived in apartments. You felt kind of like those that had and didn't have. Less than, all of that. And I'm sure there was biases both ways. Mm-hmm. It shapes a lot of who you are and what you're doing.
Right.
So yeah, lots of important questions to ask regarding Native American, but also African American, and all our communities, right? I think these are not uncommon stories and responses to things. It also speaks very loudly to the need to provide our students with the civic knowledge that they'll need. And we're going to get into this because you and I are very close to that. You've been touching on this empowerment, how and doing that forward has always been, Barb and I, a lot of our work to go directly to policymakers, because that's how you change systems of power.
Exactly.
You've got to go to who's holding the reins, who's creating the policies, how do we make those shifts? And it's not just at the federal level, it's state, it's just even in our own local levels too. This is providing more reasons to promote civic education for all our students, beginning even in the lowest of grades, kindergarten, first, second grade, is really how we're going to impact, I think, some important change. So part 4, give us a snapshot. What are we going to explore
So
there?
part 4 is radical healing.
Yes.
So we talked about California past, transformational resistance, and what groups have been here, but how they transformed their identity and position in society to achieve their dream, right? Mm-hmm. And then we talked about, okay, some groups are still struggling, many groups are, and so what does justice look like? You know, and what is hope and justice? How are those two things interrelated as we go more towards a more equitable society? And so that begs the last question, how do you do it?
How do you do it?
Democracy.
Because how you do it is important.
Yes. Democracy is a verb, and that's from the Mikla Challenge, right? And we're going to talk about how you do it. And a lot of it kind of connects back to the transformative resistance and the critical hope, because in the how you do it is the story of the Hmong people in the Central Valley. It's the story of Jose Hernandez, right? It's the story of Barack Obama.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, again, looking forward to
All right.
part 4.
Looking forward to part 4. Thank you, Barb. Great stuff.